I cooked, cleaned, and sacrificed my son, told me I had to leave his house. My name is Elaine Porter, and the night my son told me to leave his house, I was slicing carrots for a soup he would never eat again. I had always thought sacrifice was love's purest form. I woke up early, made everyone's breakfast, folded the laundry, no one noticed, and scrubbed floors that were dirtied again within minutes. I was okay with being invisible. In fact, I told myself it was noble what mothers did. What good mothers did. Daniel, my only son, was everything to me. I lost my husband when Daniel was just 9. He was riding his bike when the police came to the door. After that, I became mother and father. I picked up extra hours at the school cafeteria. I canceled my own doctor's appointments to pay for his cleats, his braces, his college fees. When he married Melissa, I smiled and told myself she was kind, even when her hugs were stiff and her eyes skipped right past mine. When their second child came, they said they needed help. I sold my small house and moved in with them, promising it was temporary. I used the proceeds to help with their down payment. They called it our home. I never asked for a key. I didn't need one. I was already there before they woke up, and long after they went to bed. But something shifted slowly, like the way soup cools in a bowl you forget to serve. I first noticed it when Melissa asked me to knock before entering the kitchen. "It's not about you," she said, lips tight, eyes scanning her phone. "We just want to set boundaries." Boundaries. I'd raised their children from diapers, and now I needed permission to use the stove. Still, I tried not to take it personally. People grow, families shift. I swallowed the sting and adjusted. I made tea quietly in the morning, tiptoed around the house in socks asked before doing the laundry. I became a guest in the home I helped buy, but even that wasn't enough. There was a Sunday dinner I'll never forget. I'd spent hours marinating chicken, preparing Melissa's favorite roasted garlic potatoes, even baking a pie from scratch, my mother's recipe. When we sat down to eat, she looked at the food, then at Daniel, and said, "You know, we've been trying to eat clean." Then she scraped the food off her plate and went to make a smoothie. Daniel said nothing. It wasn't just meals. It was birthdays forgotten. Mother's Day cards signed but not written. It was the empty space in group photos, the way they laughed at inside jokes I didn't understand. I was slowly being erased, but I didn't stop. I told myself, just keep giving. Just keep being useful. Love is shown, not said. So I scrubbed the baseboards when no one noticed, left gift cards on their pillows, and put the children to sleep with songs from my childhood. The kids still loved me. Their little hands still reached for mine. That, I thought, was enough. Until one afternoon, Melissa walked in while I was folding Daniel's shirts. She looked me square in the eye and said, "Elaine, we've talked about this. It's weird when you touch his things. You need to have some respect." Respect. I was stunned. I hadn't touched another man's shirt since my husband died. My hands trembled as I put the shirts back, each one folded with care I now realized wasn't welcome. I waited for Daniel to say something, to tell her she was being harsh, but he didn't. He just stood behind her, silent, arms crossed like a teenager being grounded. That night, I sat in my small guest room and cried quietly. I didn't want the children to hear. I didn't want anyone to think I was weak. But something in me cracked like an old plate you drop and pretend isn't chipped. Then came the moment I'll never forget. It was Tuesday. I had just finished wiping down the kitchen. Daniel came in. His voice was tight, rehearsed. "Mom, Melissa and I think it's time you found your own place. The kids are older now. You've done so much, but it's our house." I blinked. Our house? I wanted to laugh, to scream, to remind him I gave up my house, that I gave them the money for this place, that every floorboard held a piece of me. But instead I nodded. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why. I just said, okay. That night I cooked them one last dinner. Meatloaf, green beans, mashed potatoes. Daniel's favorite. No one thanked me. I cleaned the kitchen, then sat in my room staring at the walls, wondering where I'd go. Wondering how love could be so conditional. And then quietly I began to plan. Because what they didn't know, what I had never told them, was that I hadn't spent all the money from my house. And I hadn't wasted my years. I'd saved, I'd invested, and the woman they called just a mother was about to become something else entirely. I didn't sleep much that night. The shadows on the ceiling moved like quiet accusations, whispering every sacrifice I had made, every moment I had said yes when I should have said enough. But amidst the bitterness, there was clarity, sharp and cold like winter air. I got up early as I always did before anyone else stirred. I made coffee not for them, but for myself this time, and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window as the morning light spread across the backyard. The place where I used to push the kids on swings now looked strangely unfamiliar. Like I was peeking into someone else's life. I opened my old file folder tucked deep into a suitcase in my closet. Inside were the statements they didn't know about my savings account, my investments, the documents I'd quietly organized over the years. I wasn't rich, not by some standards, but I had nearly $400,000 saved. I had been diligent, disciplined. Every leftover dollar, every school bonus, every tax return, they all went somewhere. I read financial blogs after bedtime. I followed investment threads. I put money into an index fund when no one was watching. Later, when my husband's sister passed, she left me $400, $400. It was a surprise to everyone. She never had children, and we'd stayed close over the years, sharing recipes and holidays. I told no one. I didn't even tell Daniel. I had been planning to give that inheritance to him. I even printed the transfer forms. But then, that conversation in the kitchen happened, and I realized something. My generosity had not only gone unnoticed, it had become expected. So I made a new plan. The next morning, I started looking for apartments. I wasn't going to wait around for them to pack my bags and hand me a bus ticket. No, I would leave with dignity. Quietly, yes, but with my head high. That day, I picked up the kids from school. Melissa usually did, but she had a spa appointment. As we walked home, the youngest, Lily, looked up at me and said, "Grandma, are you sad today?" I forced a smile. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" She looked down, fidgeting with her backpack. "Because Mommy said you're moving out and I don't want you to go." I paused. My throat tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make changes, Lily, but I'll always be nearby." She nodded, but her eyes welled up. "Who will make pancakes on Saturdays?" I didn't have an answer. Back at the house, Melissa barely looked up when we entered. "Thanks," she said, scrolling through her phone. "I booked a moving company for the weekend. They'll come at noon Saturday." It was Thursday. I wanted to say, "You couldn't even wait a week." But instead I said nothing. Silence, I've learned, can echo louder than rage. That night, I called a woman named Alice, an old friend from church who'd moved into a retirement community. Not one of those sad beige places. No, this was more like a peaceful village. Small cottages, lush gardens, people my age who smiled when they saw you. She said there was one cottage available. Small, but with a porch and a fireplace. And no one would tell me I needed to knock before entering my own kitchen. I scheduled a tour for Friday. Friday morning, Daniel had already left for work. Melissa was in the bathroom curling her hair. I took one long look at the living room where I'd once put up the family Christmas tree. There were no pictures of me on the wall. Only their wedding photos, school pictures of the kids, and a giant quote board that said, "Family is everything." I almost laughed. At the retirement community, I met Alice near the fountain. She hugged me tight, then walked me through the garden paths. The cottage was simple, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, sun streaming through the windows. It smelled like lavender. "This could be yours," she said, handing me a brochure. I nodded. "It already is." That evening, I made dinner for myself and ate on the back porch alone. Melissa didn't ask where I'd gone all day. The children were at a sleepover. The silence felt like freedom. On Saturday, the movers arrived. They weren't surprised when I greeted them at the door with packed boxes. One even said, "Most people are never this organized." I smiled. As we loaded the last box into the truck, Daniel arrived. He looked surprised to see everything ready. "Mom, you didn't have to..." I held up a hand. "It's okay." He hesitated. "We appreciate what you've done." It was the first time in weeks he looked at me directly. I nodded. "Take care of the kids." Then I got into the cab of the truck and didn't look back. What Daniel didn't know, what Melissa would never suspect, was that I wasn't walking away broken. I was walking into something I'd built in silence. And the next time they'd hear my name, it wouldn't be as nanny or houseguest or burden. It would be on the deed to something far greater than they ever imagined. The drive to the new place was quiet. I sat beside the driver, an older gentleman who smelled faintly of peppermint and motor oil. He didn't ask questions, and I was thankful. I wasn't in the mood for polite conversation. I stared out the window, watching the city I had helped raise my family in slowly slip behind me. The familiar buildings, the corner bakery I took the grandkids to, the bus stop where Daniel waited every school day. It all felt like it belonged to another woman. When we pulled up to the retirement community, I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The cottage stood there like a quiet promise. White shutters, a front porch swing, a flower bed filled with violets and thyme. It wasn't large, but it was mine. Completely mine. The movers helped carry in my few belongings. My books, my quilt, my tea set. A framed photo of Daniel when he was 6, before the world taught him to look through me instead of at me. Once everything was inside, I made tea. I sat by the window, fingers wrapped around the warm mug, and listened to the silence. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Later that evening, Alice came by with a welcome basket, homemade muffins, chamomile tea, and a handwritten card. She looked around the cottage, then at me. "You look relieved," she said gently. "I feel like I can breathe," I replied. "For the first time in years." She smiled and placed a hand on my arm. "Good. Because you deserve to. You've given enough." After she left, I unpacked one last box, the one they didn't know about. It contained the full printouts of my portfolio, bank account statements, and an envelope I had labeled, "In case I die before I tell them." Inside was the truth. See, when I received the $400,000 inheritance from Daniel's aunt, I had already saved nearly that much on my own, quietly, over decades. I never made more than $28,000 a year, but I saved, I budgeted, I reinvested, and when I realized how little my presence meant in my own home, I decided my money wouldn't be a final act of desperate love. It would be a reminder. The next day, I met with my financial advisor, Judy. She greeted me warmly. "Still flying under the radar, Nancy." Very much so, I smiled. We updated my records to my new address and discussed my latest investment, a real estate development group that promised strong returns. I wasn't just sitting on my money, I was letting it work quietly and powerfully, just like me. After the meeting, I bought myself a slice of lemon cake from a cafe I'd always passed, but never entered. I ate it slowly alone, without anyone asking if I had made dinner yet or folded their laundry. That night, as I curled into bed with a new book, I got a message from Daniel. "Mom, the kids are asking about you. Can they come visit this weekend?" I stared at the screen. The words were polite, but I could feel the gap. They weren't from a son who missed his mother. They were from a man navigating guilt. Still, I replied, "Of course. I'll pick them up Saturday at noon." Saturday came, and I drove up to their house. Lily came running out first, followed by Josh. Melissa stood on the porch, arms crossed. Daniel was nowhere in sight. "You look rested," she said flatly. "Thanks," I smiled. "The air's different where I live." I didn't ask to come inside. I didn't offer to help with the week's laundry. I simply held the car door open for the children and watched Melissa's eyes follow me with something close to suspicion. At the cottage, we baked cookies, painted birdhouses, and watched old cartoons. The kids asked me questions I hadn't been asked in years. "Grandma, who was your best friend when you were a kid? What's your favorite ice cream flavor? Did you ever want to be an astronaut?" They weren't just there for convenience. They were there for connection. When I dropped them back home on Sunday evening, Lily clung to me. "Can we come again next weekend?" I looked at Melissa. She shrugged. "As long as they're back by dinner." I knelt and kissed Lily's forehead. "I'd love that." Driving away, I didn't feel like a mother cast aside. I felt like a woman reborn. They had tried to erase me quietly, but I had rewritten the story loud enough for the silence to tremble. And this was only the beginning. Monday morning came with a soft knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I opened it to find Daniel standing there, awkwardly holding a box of pastries from the French bakery he used to mock for being too fancy. "Morning, Mom," he said, forcing a smile. "Daniel," I replied, stepping aside. "Come in." He looked around the cottage, his eyes lingering on the antique clock, the neat bookshelf, the air of independence that filled the room like sunlight. "This place is nice, cozier than I imagined." I like it. It's quiet, I said, pouring tea into two mismatched cups. And no one tells me when to come and go. He flinched just slightly. I didn't push it. He sat across from me and cleared his throat. Melissa thinks maybe we were too hasty. About the move. She's been under a lot of stress and… I held up my hand. Daniel, don't twist your spine trying to apologize for someone else's behavior. You're not responsible for her words. Only your silence. He blinked, startled. I could see the old Daniel in his eyes. The boy who used to cry when he thought he hurt someone's feelings. He had buried that softness in adult logic, but it hadn't died. I didn't know how bad things had gotten. He said quietly, "You never said anything. You never asked." I replied, my voice even. He nodded, shame blooming on his cheeks. "I wanted to give you something," he said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folded letter. I opened it slowly. It was an invitation to a family dinner at their home. For me, this Saturday. Melissa said she'd make your favorite beef bourguignon. I raised an eyebrow. She's never made that in her life. She Googled it. He admitted with a crooked smile. It's a start. I nodded, folding the invitation carefully. We'll see. After he left, I placed the letter in the drawer with the envelope labeled, "In case I die, before I tell them." I wasn't ready to rewrite the whole ending just yet. That week I fell into a rhythm. Mornings spent walking in the nearby gardens, afternoons painting or journaling, evenings with a book. And silence that didn't accuse. I began volunteering at the community library twice a week, teaching children to read. The librarian, Miss Arlo, had silver hair, boundless energy, and a penchant for gossip. We became fast friends. On Friday, I hosted my first small gathering, just Alice, Miss Arlo, and my neighbor Dawn, who played guitar and baked surprisingly good sourdough. We shared stories and tea until the stars came out. And for the first time in years, I laughed until my ribs ached. Saturday came faster than expected. I debated whether to go to the dinner, but curiosity tugged at me like a child pulling at her mother's sleeve. When I arrived, the house looked the same. But something had shifted. The porch had fresh flowers. The living room was tidier. Melissa wore a blouse I had complimented once but never saw again. Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. The beef was a little dry, but the gesture was genuine. The kids clung to me, and even Melissa made small talk without barbed edges. But the real shift came after dessert. Daniel stood, cleared his throat, and held up a small box. "Mom," he said, voice wavering, "we wanted to give you something." I opened the box slowly. Inside was a gold bracelet. Nothing extravagant, but etched on the inside were the words, "For all you carried." I stared at it for a long moment, then slipped it on. "Thank you," I said simply. "It's beautiful." Melissa's eyes shimmered with something like tears. But even as the room filled with warmth, I knew something deeper had changed. They weren't trying to own me anymore. They were starting to see me. That night, as I returned to my cottage, I looked around and smiled. The bracelet caught the moonlight. I touched it gently and whispered to myself, "You didn't break. You just changed form." The next morning, I woke up early, sunlight filtering through my cottage curtains like golden threads stitching together a brand new day. I touched the bracelet still on my wrist, not out of vanity, but as if it were a reminder, one that whispered, "You're more than what they see." As I brewed my coffee, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Mom, the kids asked if they can spend the weekend with you soon. They miss you." A slow, surprised smile formed on my lips. That was new. I replied simply, "Of course, anytime." That Sunday, I took myself to the park with a novel, a flask of tea, and a folding chair. I watched families drift by, some arguing, some laughing. Some children clung to their parents, others walked 3 feet ahead as if embarrassed by affection. Life in all its messy forms kept moving. And I realized something. I had stopped waiting for apologies. I didn't need grand gestures anymore. I just needed truth. Later that week, I returned to the library and noticed Miss Arlo waiting for me with a mischievous gleam in her eye. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, pulling a man from the nonfiction aisle. He was tall, silver-haired, with a quiet presence and eyes that noticed everything. "Margaret, this is Charles. He just retired from teaching economics. Loves poetry, hates olives." We shook hands. His palm was warm, his grip firm. "Nice to meet you," he said in a voice that felt like gravel softened by velvet. Over the next few weeks, Charles and I began sharing coffee after my library shifts. We never labeled anything. We simply met, talked, listened. "You speak like someone who's been through hell and found the stars on the way back," he said one afternoon. I blinked. "And you listen like someone who doesn't need to fix anyone." We sat in silence after that, the kind that feels full instead of empty. Meanwhile, things with Daniel began to shift in small, cautious steps. He'd text me about the kids' school events. Melissa started sending photos. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of updates that used to be reserved for real family members. I knew better than to think everything had changed. People don't turn corners, they take curves, and sometimes they circle back. But one afternoon, as I was painting a small canvas for my kitchen, Daniel called. "Mom," he said, "we were wondering if you'd consider moving back in." My brush froze mid-stroke. I stared at the cobalt blue against white. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said quietly. There was silence on the line. Then, "I understand." And for the first time in months, he didn't argue. He didn't guilt or plead. He just accepted it. Growth isn't always loud. It's sometimes found in the spaces where ego used to live. That evening, I made soup from scratch and listened to classical music. No TV, no distractions. Just the hum of life returning to itself. As I sipped my soup, I thought about all the years I spent serving others, measuring my worth in meals, cooked socks, folded floors, scrubbed. They had called it love when it was compliance. They had called it motherhood when it was martyrdom. But now I was more than just a mother. I was Margaret Whittaker, reader of forgotten novels, painter of quiet mornings, collector of soft-spoken sunsets, and maybe someone worth knowing outside of what I could do for others. I put my bowl in the sink, turned off the light, and stepped outside. The stars were scattered across the sky like confetti from a celebration I hadn't been invited to, but showed up for anyway. Because finally I knew. My presence wasn't conditional, my value wasn't negotiable, and my story was still being written on my own terms. A few days later, I walked into a local bookstore and ran my fingers along the spines of books like old friends. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just wandering, breathing, relishing the luxury of time. The kind of time that isn't tethered to someone else's schedule or expectations. That in itself felt like a quiet rebellion. That's when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mom." I turned surprised. It was Daniel standing in the poetry aisle. He looked unsure, his hands deep in his jacket pockets. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said quickly. "Didn't expect to see you here." I raised an eyebrow. "I come here every Thursday." He scratched his chin, sheepish. "Guess I should have known that." We stood there for a moment in silence before he asked, "Do you want to grab coffee?" We sat at the corner cafe just down the street. It wasn't awkward, but it wasn't easy either. Years of unspoken emotions hung between us like cobwebs. "I've been thinking a lot," he finally said. "About everything. You, the house. The way things went down." I stayed quiet, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "You were always there," he said. "Always. And I think I got so used to that, I forgot what it meant. What you sacrificed." Still, I said nothing. He looked me in the eye. "Melissa and I, we treated you like a fixture. Like a piece of furniture that just came with the house. But you're not. You're a person. My mother. And I forgot that." His voice cracked, and suddenly I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to draw me crooked flowers on construction paper and kiss my hand when he thought I was sad. "I'm sorry, Mom." I finally reached for my cup, took a sip, then looked at him. "You don't need to say the right words, Daniel," I said. "You just need to mean them." "I do," he said. "I do." I didn't cry. I'd already done my crying in the quiet corners of a house that once felt like mine. What I felt instead was a strange kind of peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally shifted. That night, I called Charles and told him about the conversation. He listened, patient as always. "Sounds like you got your moment," he said. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I finally stopped needing one." That weekend, the kids came over to my cottage. We baked cookies. They painted pictures on my front porch. I watched them play in the yard and felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been knotted there for too long. One of them, little Ava, tugged on my sweater and said, "Grandma, this house feels happy." I knelt down to her level. "It is, sweetheart. Because it's mine." The next week I mailed a letter. Not to Daniel, not to Melissa, to myself. It read, "You did everything they asked. And then you did more. You gave up pieces of yourself they never saw. And when they pushed you out, you didn't fall. You stood taller. This world doesn't give medals to mothers who survive silently, but you don't need one. You are your own reward." I sealed it and tucked it into my kitchen drawer. A reminder, not of the pain, but of the power that came after. Because I had cooked, I had cleaned, I had sacrificed, and they had told me to leave. But now I was finally home. The weeks passed gently like soft waves lapping at the shore. There was a stillness in my life now, not the kind born of emptiness, but of peace. Earned, fought for, really. I filled my days with things I never had time for before. Morning walks through the park, crossword puzzles on my porch. Sunday potlucks with new neighbors who quickly became friends. But sometimes peace invites reflection, and reflection brings its own storms. One morning, I received a call from Mrs. Gupta, a neighbor from the old neighborhood. She was the kind of woman who knew everything about everyone, not out of malice, but simply because she paid attention. "I thought you should know," she said gently. "They've listed the house, Daniel and Melissa, for sale." I blinked. "Already." They said they want to downsize. "But between us, I think there's trouble." I thanked her and hung up. I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something in me. That house wasn't mine anymore. Not legally, not emotionally. But hearing it would be sold felt like erasing the last brushstroke of a painting I'd spent my whole life working on. I stared out the window, gripping my mug. And that's when I realized I hadn't returned since I left. Not once. So I went. I didn't tell anyone. I simply drove by. Parked across the street. The for sale sign stood there like a stranger on the lawn announcing something final. I watched a couple walk through the yard with an agent. The woman admired the porch rails I painted by hand one summer while Daniel was away at college. The man pointed toward the kitchen window. I imagined him asking if the light hit just right in the morning. Yes, I wanted to tell him. It does. And in the winter, the frost makes little stars on that pane if you leave the curtains open. But I said nothing. I just watched. The house looked smaller somehow. Or maybe I had grown. Suddenly a memory flooded back me, crouched in the kitchen at midnight wiping up spilled soup after Melissa's accident. My back aching and heart sore because no one thanked me. No one even knew. And yet, I stayed. For so long I had stayed. But that wasn't weakness. It was devotion. The kind you carry like a flame even when no one sees it. Back at home, I sat with Charles again. We'd become something close to best friends, though neither of us used the word. It didn't matter, we understood each other. "Do you miss them?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way people think." He nodded. "Sometimes we miss what we hoped they'd become." I smiled, bitter and sweet. Exactly. We played cards that evening under soft lights and the hum of old jazz. It was the kind of night that didn't demand anything of me. No cooking, no cleaning, no holding back tears behind pantry doors. Later, I received an email from Daniel. Subject: "The house. Mom, we're moving out at the end of the month. Melissa and we're going our separate ways." It's a long story. I know this is awkward, but I wanted to ask if you'd like to see the house one last time before it sells. I stared at the screen. I didn't know what I'd say, but I knew I'd go. Because closure isn't about doors closing. It's about deciding which ones you'll never open again. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was undecided clouds gathering like gossip above sunlight slipping through in patches like secrets being kept. I parked in the same spot where I used to wait for Daniel after soccer practice. It felt like slipping into an old coat, one that didn't quite fit anymore, but still carried warmth in its lining. The door was unlocked just as he'd promised in the email. No one was home. No Melissa. No Danielle. Just me and the quiet. I stepped in and the air hit me familiar, yet hollow. The scent of old wood polish still lingered faintly in the foyer, mixed now with the sterility of a house emptied of meaning. Echoes clung to the corners. The walls had been repainted. Neutral. Safe. Gone were the family photos, the messy collage I had once taped up near the kitchen pictures of Daniel as a boy me, with flour on my cheeks, birthday hats slanted on heads that once leaned on my shoulder. I walked slowly through each room. The kitchen made me pause longest. It was cleaner now, almost clinical, but I could still see the burnt mark on the countertop where I'd spilled caramel. They never replaced it. Funny, isn't it? What people keep, what they overlook. Upstairs, I went to the guest room, my room once. The bed was gone, the closet empty, but one small thing remained on the shelf. A jar painted by hand, red and chipped at the rim. Daniel made it in 3rd grade, gave it to me for Mother's Day. I picked it up and held it close as if it might still be warm. I left it there. Back downstairs, I sat for a moment on the bottom stair. I didn't cry. I didn't sigh. I just breathed, feeling the way air moved differently through a house without stories being lived in. And then I heard the door. Daniel. He stepped in, startled. "Oh, Mom, you're here." I nodded. "I got your email." He stood awkwardly in the living room, the way men do when they no longer know where they fit in the picture they helped frame. "Melissa's gone," he said quietly. I said nothing. "She said a lot of things. I didn't listen when I should have. About you. About what she wanted." "And what did she want, Daniel?" My voice wasn't cold. It was just tired. He looked down. "She thought you were a burden. She said you'd taken over the house. That she felt judged." I smiled gently. "I never judged her. I know that now. I let her talk me into thinking you were the problem." I stood, walked to the kitchen, touched the edge of the counter. "Did she know about the $800,000? Daniel looked up, startled. "What?" I turned to him. "That day, the day I was going to tell you, I had signed the papers. I wanted to give you and her a future." He looked like a boy again, confused, ashamed. "I didn't know." "But she did," I said, quiet now. "I overheard her. She wanted me out. That's when I changed my mind." He sat on the couch, head in hands. "I ruined everything." "No," I said. "You just let someone else do the talking for too long." The room settled between us like dust. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said finally. "But you did." "I know." And there it was. Truth in its simplest form. No excuses. No revisions. Just air cleared by honesty. I walked to the door. Turned the knob. "You'll be all right, Daniel. Eventually. But this house, it was never really yours. Not until now. Take care of it better than you took care of me." I left before he could answer. Outside, the clouds had cleared. The cab ride back to the city felt longer than usual, as if the road had stretched itself out to give me time to grieve properly. But I didn't grieve, not in the traditional sense. What I felt was a quiet clarity, like when fog lifts from the coastline and you can finally see how far the drop is. It's not frightening. It's just true. I moved into a modest apartment overlooking a community garden. The kind where volunteers planted marigolds in crooked rows and argued over tomato cages. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Entirely mine. I bought the softest sheets I could find, a new kettle for tea, and a beautiful armchair near the window where I could sit and let the morning sun kiss my knees. Each day I wrote a little, nothing profound, just reflections, memories, pieces of a life that had too often been put on pause. I wrote about raising Daniel, about the recipes passed down from my grandmother, about the first time I learned to balance a checkbook. And yes, I wrote about Melissa. There was power in telling the truth. Not for revenge, not to hurt, but to witness. To say, this happened, and I'm still standing. One morning, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. "Mom," it began. "I don't know what to say, except I'm sorry. Not just for what happened at the house, but for all the ways I stopped seeing you. Melissa left, took half of what we had, and now, sitting alone in that house, I hear the silence differently. I see what you were holding up all those years, and I wonder how I missed it." He ended with, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if you ever feel like talking, I'll be here." I placed the letter in a small wooden box. I didn't write back right away. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea, sat in the armchair, and thought about forgiveness. Not as a gift I owed him, but as something I might one day offer myself. Later that week, I volunteered to teach a financial literacy workshop at the local library. I wasn't a certified advisor, but I'd lived enough, learned enough to know what mattered. The room was filled with women like me, grandmothers raising grandchildren, widows who'd never balanced a budget, mothers with dreams they'd shelved to survive. I told them my story, not the bitter parts, but the resilient ones. I told them how I started investing small amounts, how I'd read books by the light of the oven clock at midnight, how I made mistakes and learned from them, and how over time I built something real quiet: wealth, strong choices, freedom on my own terms. One woman, eyes shining, said, "You're a miracle." I smiled. "No, I'm a reminder. You can begin again." Word traveled. Soon I was leading weekly sessions. They paid me a little, but more than that, they gave me purpose. I wasn't just Evelyn the mother anymore. I wasn't Evelyn the burden. I was Evelyn the guide, the woman who could take years of silence and turn it into a map for others. The irony: the very life Melissa had dismissed, the one she called insignificant, became the blueprint for dozens of women trying to rebuild. One evening, I saw Daniel's number flash across my phone. I let it ring. Then I listened to the voicemail. "Hi, Mom. I'm standing in the kitchen. That counter you loved so much. I tried to scrub out that caramel stain. Couldn't do it. And I remembered what you said about how we overlook the wrong things and keep the rest." He paused. "I'm trying to keep the right things now. If you ever want to visit, the guest room's ready. I kept your jar on the shelf." He hung up. And just like that, something in me softened. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe its early cousin: willingness. The decision to visit didn't come quickly. I let weeks pass, then months. I wanted to be sure I wasn't just reacting to nostalgia or loneliness. Healing isn't a race, it's a recalibration. A return to your own rhythm after too long dancing to someone else's. But on a Saturday morning, after folding laundry and watching the sunlight pour through the blinds, I packed a small overnight bag. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. I wore a soft navy blouse, the one my mother had always said made my eyes look kind, and a pair of slacks that didn't wrinkle no matter how I sat. I took the bus, not out of pride, but because I needed time. To see the neighborhoods roll by, to smell the hot pretzels, to remember who I was outside of anyone's opinion. When I stepped up to Daniel's house, still trimmed in white paint, still with that small front porch, I didn't knock right away. I stood there listening. The wind moved gently through the hedges. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed. The porch boards creaked just slightly beneath my shoes, as if remembering the weight of me. Then I knocked. The door opened slowly. Daniel looked older, more tired, but also stripped of something heavy. Maybe shame, maybe illusion. "Hi, Mom," he said, as if the words were fragile glass in his mouth. "Hello, Daniel." We didn't hug. Not yet. Instead, he stepped aside to let me in. The house looked the same, except emptier. Melissa's decorating touches were gone. No silk flowers, no glitzy frames. The home had a quieter soul now, more bare but oddly truer. He led me to the kitchen. "I made tea," he said, gesturing to the kettle. "And I tried to bake that banana bread you used to make." "It's not the same." I smiled faintly. "It never is until you forget the recipe. Then it becomes yours." We sat at the table. There was silence, the kind that used to scare me. But this time, I let it breathe. "I should have never let her talk to you that way," he said finally. "Or let myself treat you like you were in the way. You did everything, and I saw none of it." I stirred my tea. "I think I said carefully you saw. But seeing isn't the same as valuing. And maybe you couldn't value me until you were forced to miss what I held." He looked down. "I don't expect anything," he murmured. "I just wanted to say it." I studied him, the son I once rocked to sleep. The boy who used to run to me with scraped knees, the man who forgot. And yet here he was, learning, owning. That counted for something. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "But I am changed. And that means we start fresh, if we start at all." He nodded slowly. "I'd like that." Later that evening, I walked through the garden in the backyard. The one I'd once tended, the one Melissa had called a waste of space. Now it was overgrown wild with lavender and stubborn mint, but beautiful in its own unruly way. I sat on the stone bench and let the memory wash over me of Daniel playing with toy trucks of warm tomato vines and sun-drenched afternoons. I didn't cry. I just remembered. He joined me a while later, carrying 2 cups of chamomile tea. We sat in silence, watching the sky turn from amber to ink. "Do you think," he asked softly, "that people can really change?" "Not all at once," I said, "but piece by piece if they want to." He nodded. And for the first time in years, we talked not about blame or shame, but about books, music, the old house on Cedar Lane. We talked like two people who had stopped expecting to win and started learning to understand. Before bed, I stood in the guest room. My jar was still there now, holding sunflowers, and the sheets smelled faintly of lavender. Daniel had tried. Not perfectly. Not to impress me. But because maybe deep down he still remembered the way I made a place feel like home. I slept well that night. Not because all was forgiven, but because enough had shifted to make peace feel possible. The next morning, the house was quiet when I woke. I slipped out of bed and wandered into the kitchen where a note waited on the counter. "Had to step out for groceries. Thought we'd make your famous chili tonight. Be back soon, Daniel." I smiled despite myself. In another life, this would have been normal. A son thinking of his mother's favorite dish. In this life, it was an offering, clumsy perhaps, but sincere. I poured myself a cup of coffee and wandered outside. The garden still hummed with the scent of dew and soil. It felt like standing at the edge of a memory you didn't expect to survive, but did. I sat on the old bench and stared into the sky, wondering how many women like me were out there forgotten, in silence, pushed out of their own lives, written out of the chapters they helped author, and yet still standing. When Daniel returned, he brought more than groceries. He brought an apology in motion, small gestures, careful listening, asking questions about my life, instead of filling the space with his. We spent the day cooking, and for the first time in years, I moved through that kitchen, not as a maid, not as an unpaid caretaker, not as a ghost, but as someone seen. The chili bubbled slowly on the stove as we chopped, stirred and tasted like two friends rebuilding a broken bridge. At dinner, Daniel looked up and said, "Do you think you'll ever come back here?" "To stay." I paused. Coming back had always seemed like a defeat, a return to the scene of pain. But now, maybe it wasn't about the place. Maybe it was about who you are when you stand in it. "I don't know," I said truthfully. "I think for now I like the quiet I've built. But I don't mind visiting the echoes." He nodded, though I saw the flicker of sadness. "I get that," he said, "but maybe one day." After dinner, we went through old boxes he'd brought down from the attic, photographs, crayon drawings, school report cards with gold stars. Every scrap of memory that I'd once saved in albums and he'd stuffed into bins. He held up one picture, me in a red sweater holding a toddler Daniel at the zoo. "You were beautiful," he said softly. "I still am," I replied, and it wasn't arrogance. It was reclamation. He laughed, not mockingly, but with a reverence that said he finally believed it too. Then he grew quiet. "Mom," he said, eyes fixed on the photograph. "Can I tell you something hard?" I waited. "I wasn't just listening to Melissa. I resented you. Not for who you were, but for how much I needed you. And that made me cruel." It landed like a stone in the still water of the evening. But instead of breaking me, it made things clear. "Dependency isn't weakness," I said. "But pretending it is, that's where men fall." He looked up. "You're not just my mother," he whispered. "You're the backbone of my life." And I tried to snap it. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I reached for his hand. Rough from years of building and breaking. "You can't unsay what's been said," I told him. "But you can choose what echoes next." That night, I stayed again. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see if peace could stretch across a second sunrise. When I woke, a tray sat beside the bed. Coffee, toast, a small glass of orange juice, and a single folded note. "For all the mornings I forgot to see you. D." I sipped slowly, letting the bitterness of the coffee remind me that some things don't need sugar. Just presence. Later that week, I returned home. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but because I needed to be in a space where my identity wasn't defined by someone else's expectations. My house, small, modest, full of chipped mugs and sun-faded curtains, felt like truth. And truth, I realized, didn't need to be loud to be powerful. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks after I left, a letter arrived, handwritten, from Melissa. I held it for hours before opening it. Inside were exactly 4 sentences. I know I hurt you. I didn't understand your strength until it threatened everything I'd built. I see now that your silence was never weakness, it was grace. I'm sorry. No flourish, no flattery. Just truth laid bare like winter branches. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I sat at my desk and opened a manila envelope. Inside were the financial papers for the $800,000 I had quietly invested. Growth summaries, dividend projections, estate clauses. I'd rewritten the will. Daniel would still receive a share, but only after proving that he could build something on his own. Not to punish him, to awaken him. And a new clause had been added. 30% of the funds would be donated in my name to a foundation supporting women who had been displaced by family rejection. Women like me. Women who cooked, cleaned, and raised generations only to be cast aside like fading wallpaper. I wasn't a warrior, but I had become something sharper. A quiet architect of consequence. One day while pruning my roses, I heard a knock. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there alone. I know I messed up again, he began. You didn't, I said, stepping aside. You're here. He took in the room, the photographs, the worn floorboards. This house smells like childhood, he said. That's because it is. He followed me into the kitchen where a kettle whistled gently on the stove. We sat across from one another like 2 people finally speaking the same language. Melissa and we're in counseling, he said. I'm learning how to listen, not just to her, to myself, and to what I took from you. I nodded. And what did you take? He looked up, not flinching. Your worth. And in that moment, I forgave him again, not because he deserved it, but because I refused to live a life defined by wounds. Forgiveness, after all, wasn't surrender. It was freedom. Before he left, I handed him a small envelope. Your birthday gift, I said. He opened it to find a photograph. Him at age 4, sleeping on my chest, his fist wrapped around my necklace. On the back I had written, even when you pushed me away, you were still my son. But now I see the man. He folded the picture and slipped it into his wallet. I watched him leave, not with fear that he'd forget me again, but with hope that he wouldn't forget himself. Later that night, I sat at my desk and began writing again. Not letters, stories, my stories, the ones I had hidden beneath laundry piles and silent dinners. And this time, I wasn't afraid of being too much, too loud, or too proud. I had cooked. I had cleaned. I had sacrificed. But I had also risen. The next morning, the sun crept in through the lace curtains, kissing the corners of the living room, with light that felt softer than usual, like even the day itself was trying to make peace. I stood by the window, tea in hand, watching the wind sway the garden. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that meant absence. It was the quiet of balance. Then my phone rang. The screen flashed. Melissa. I hesitated. Let it ring once, twice, then picked up. Hi. Her voice was small but not hollow. I wanted to ask if you'd come to dinner, just the 3 of us. No kids, no obligations. For a beat, I couldn't breathe. Is this because of what Daniel said? I asked. No, she replied. It's because of what I never said. I need to say it now. Later that evening, I stood outside their home, the same one I had been told to leave. The brick still wore the same color, the mailbox still leaned slightly left, but something about the air had shifted. Melissa opened the door. Her eyes looked different, less armored, more searching. We sat at the table where so many arguments had taken root. This time there were no fancy dishes, no candles, just takeout and 2 cups of wine. I used to see you as a rival, Melissa confessed. You had this way of being loved, and I felt like I could never compete. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence do its work. Then I said there was never a competition. I wasn't here to win. I was just here. She nodded. And I'm sorry. For everything. For making Daniel choose. For treating you like help. for forgetting that you were a woman before you were his mother. That last part hit something deep, because I had been a woman once, before all the titles, before all the giving, and it mattered that someone finally saw her. Daniel joined us soon after. We laughed awkwardly at first, then like people peeling off armor one breath at a time. He brought out an old photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. We flipped through pages of birthday parties, burnt Thanksgiving turkeys, and Daniel's first school play. And then there was a picture of me, hair, wild eyes, soft, holding baby Daniel, with a look that could melt glaciers. Melissa stared at it. "You looked so young," she whispered. I said, but I aged fast. No one said anything after that, because some truths don't need commentary. By the time I left that night, something had shifted. It wasn't a full circle, it was a step. And in families, sometimes one step is all it takes to change the direction of a story. As I walked back into my own home, I noticed something new. Not on the walls, not in the mirror, but inside me. I had spent years shrinking, serving, surviving. But now there was room to expand. And so I did. The next day, I took the first real vacation of my life. I booked a flight to Alaska, always wanted to see the northern lights. No one understood why. I didn't explain. Because for once, I wasn't performing motherhood. I was practicing womanhood. I sent Daniel a postcard from Fairbanks. On the back I scribbled, "Love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the quiet of letting someone be who they were before the world told them otherwise." He never replied, but when I got home there was a voicemail. "Mom, I hung that postcard on the fridge. Melissa framed your photo, and I've started reading your old journals. I never knew how many nights you went without sleep just so I could chase dreams. Thank you." I pressed save, because some messages deserve to live forever. Weeks passed and a calm rhythm found its way into my days. I no longer walked on eggshells in my own skin. I no longer braced for disappointment when the phone rang. One morning, while sipping my now beloved hazelnut coffee and watching the sun rise over the backyard fence, I opened an envelope postmarked from Daniel. Inside was a handwritten note and a deed transfer document. He had added me back onto the house, not as a guest, not as a caretaker, as owner. "I know you may never want to live here again," the letter read, "but I want you to know you'll always have a place. This is still your home." I sat still for a long time. It wasn't about the house. It was about being seen, about being returned a piece of something taken, my dignity, my belonging, my roots. Later that day, I called Daniel. "I'm not moving back," I told him. "But thank you." "I know," he replied. "I just needed to make it right." And for once, he wasn't rushing through the call. He wasn't preoccupied. He was present. As the months rolled on, things weren't perfect, but they were real. Melissa sent me little texts now and then. A new recipe, a joke, a meme she thought I'd find funny. And sometimes I did. On Thanksgiving, they invited me. And for the first time, no one expected me to cook. I sat at the head of the table, a glass of wine in hand, watching my son carve the turkey like I used to. When dessert came, Melissa handed me a gift. It was a small box. Inside was a gold locket. On one side, a photo of Daniel as a boy. On the other, a photo of me taken on my trip to Alaska under the shimmering northern lights. "I know this doesn't fix things," Melissa said, eyes shining, "but I want you to know. I see you now, not just as a mother, but as a person, and I admire her." I clutched the locket tightly, my throat thick with emotion. That night, I looked in the mirror and smiled, not because everything had healed perfectly, but because I had found the version of myself that existed long before diapers and dinner plates. I had found the courage to set boundaries, to rediscover desires, to take up space. And I had done it not with anger, not with vengeance, but with presence. One evening in December, I hosted a small dinner at my home. Just 6 people. Me, my neighbor Claire, her partner, and Daniel and Melissa, with their little girl Sophie. It was the kind of night that warms your bones. Fireplace, crackling pies, cooling on the counter, old jazz humming in the background. At one point, Sophie climbed into my lap and whispered, "Grandma, tell me a story." I leaned in and said, "Once upon a time, there was a woman who gave everything for love. But one day she remembered to give something back to herself. And that That made all the difference. Sophie blinked slowly, her tiny fingers resting against my chest, where the locket now lived. And I realized maybe that was the real inheritance. Not money, not houses, not deeds, but legacy. The kind you build quietly with the strength of invisible work and the courage to finally speak. The years that followed were gentle, not without their own small storms, but nothing like the betrayal that had once cracked me open. I began volunteering at the Community Literacy Center 3 days a week, helping young mothers who hadn't finished school reclaim their education. There was a quiet pride in that, watching someone remember their worth letter by letter just as I had. Daniel and Melissa kept showing up, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but with effort. One spring morning, they brought Sophie over with finger-painted cards and a small envelope. I opened it and laughed. 2 tickets to Paris. We figured Daniel said you've been taking care of others your whole life. Maybe now you let the world take care of you. I did go. I wandered Montmartre and stood beneath the Eiffel Tower. I sipped wine by the Seine and wrote postcards with soft hands that no longer scrubbed floors or folded resentment into laundry. And when I came home, I planted a garden. Just for me. I chose wildflowers that bloomed in strange colors, lavender that curled like memory rosemary that reminded me of roast chickens from simpler times. I remember one afternoon in late May lying back in the garden, sun warming my face. Sophie was chasing a butterfly, her laughter ringing like chimes. Daniel was setting up a grill. Melissa was arranging tulips in a vase. No one needed anything from me in that moment. And yet I had never felt more wanted, more home. As the sun dipped lower, I remembered something. An old woman at a bus stop once told me, "Sometimes the best kind of revenge is living the life they never imagined you could have without them." But I didn't want revenge anymore. What I wanted, what I had found, was peace. You see, I had cooked, I had cleaned, I had sacrificed. And yes, my son once told me I had to leave his house. But in leaving, I found mine, not made of brick or shingles or the deeds of men, but of love, of boundaries, of truth. So here's what I'll tell you before this story closes. If you've given everything and been told it's not enough, if you've been made to feel like a guest in your own legacy, if you've been dismissed, discarded, or forgotten, remember this. Your worth doesn't expire when your usefulness is overlooked. It blooms when you begin again. And you can begin again, even at 60, even when your back aches, even when the house feels too quiet. Especially then. So before you go, please remember to share this with someone who might need it. And take a moment, just one, to look in the mirror and say, I am not just a mother, not just a helper. I am a whole story. A story worth telling. A story worth living. She gave her life in teaspoons, measuring rice, scrubbing stains, stitching buttons, holding back tears. And when her hands were no longer deemed necessary, they asked her to go. No medal, no thanks, just quiet dismissal. But in that silence, something bloomed. She remembered how to walk alone, how to dream again, how to plant joy in forgotten places. The woman they called a burden became a lighthouse for others like her. A soft warning, a strong invitation. She didn't fight them with fire. She moved with grace. She didn't scream to be heard. She rebuilt in silence. And when they finally saw her, truly saw her, it was no longer from a place of guilt, but of awe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't those of triumph over enemies, but of triumph over forgetting yourself. Her name is Claire Whitman. Her story is not rare. It echoes in kitchens and birthday cards, never sent in empty chairs at holiday tables. So take her whisper with you. You can start again. You can speak. You can say no. You can stay. Or you can go. And either way, you'll be whole. Follow GracesTruth for more stories where silence speaks louder than rage.